I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Learning Thursday. If you're not familiar with our Learning Thursdays, this is an event that we host every month on the third Thursday of every month. And we go back and forth, alternate between doing an adverse childhood experiences training and doing a protective factors training. So this year we decided to concentrate on protective factors in addition to ACEs because we are always doing ACE trainings. But we want to make sure too that folks are learning the skills to help build resilience for children and for adults too. So we had last month, we had the introduction to the 5 protective factors, and each month now, every other month, we'll be focusing on one of those protective factors specifically. And I'll give you the dates for our upcoming trainings at the end. But today is our Adverse Childhood Experiences and Resilience training. I am Dana Powell, your trainer for today, and I'm the Community Engagement and Training Coordinator at Children's Trust of South Carolina. To let you know just a little bit about who we are the statewide organization focused on the prevention of child abuse and neglect. There are lots of agencies that do child abuse prevention work, even if they don't realize that they do that. I see we've got a lot of folks here who are doing some level of child abuse prevention work in their work with children and families. And certainly our United Way of the Midlands volunteers who are here, you're going to be doing child abuse prevention work, whether you recognize that or not. And hopefully by the end of today's training, you'll see where you fit into that. To let you know a little bit about how Children's Trust operates, we actually don't work directly with children and families. What we do is support programs that serve children and families, specifically some home visiting programs around the state, the Strengthening Families program, our Triple P or Positive Parenting program in different areas of the state. And then we support some coalitions, which you also see here is a part of the work that we do, because we know that no single agency or single program is going to be able to tackle the issue of child abuse and neglect prevention. So we want to support communities in working together to do that, that important work too. We provide tons of resources, and I'm going to let you know about 2 websites specifically that you can go to, and I'm going to put these in the chat for you. The first is our main site. That's scchildren.org. You can go there to find ACE specific information, which hopefully at the end of today's training, you'll be interested in finding out more about ACEs. There, we have lots of briefs that break down specific areas of ACEs, looking at the link between ACEs and poverty, the link between ACEs and race. Tons of information there. And we also have adverse childhood experiences data broken out by county. So if you're interested in finding out what the rates are of ACEs in your specific county, you'll be able to find that information there, in addition to child maltreatment data, child well-being data, all sorts of great things. And then we also have a newer website that's scparents.org. And I would definitely be remiss if I didn't tell you about that resource. This is a site that you can go to and you can enter a zip code, and that site will populate for you all of the resources that are available in that zip code. You can also look up those resources by topic. So if you're trying to connect a family to housing assistance or food assistance or utility assistance, childcare assistance, any of those things, you can access the referral information for those sources on that website by zip code. So it's a really cool thing to have. And in addition to that, you can claim your program on that website. So if you go there and you type in the zip code and you don't see the resources that you provide, you can enter that information in and claim your own spot, so that moving forward, when folks look up that zip code, they will get connected to you in that way. So scparents.org is an amazing resource. And then finally here, we lead prevention trainings. Many of you, I already mentioned, have spent lots of time with me lately. I do our early childhood development trainings, our middle childhood development trainings, our responding to abuse and neglect trainings, and then provide trainings in addition to that on adverse childhood experiences and protective factors. So you may see me again if you come back to some other Learning Thursdays. Although the rest of our adverse childhood experiences training for the rest of the year will be facilitated by master trainers outside of Children's Trust. I'm just doing the one today as a Children's Trust staff member. So for our time together today, there are four main things that we're going to look at. We're going to talk about neuroscience and look a little bit about brain development. Then we're going to get into epigenetics and understanding how adversity gets under our skin. We're going to talk about the adverse childhood experiences study, which is why all of this other information is so important. And then we're going to wrap up talking about resilience, which I think is, it's not the most important piece, because I think it's important to understand how adversity affects our brain to fully grasp the importance of building resilience. So they go hand in hand, but we definitely are going to leave you with some light at the end of the tunnel if any of the rest of the information feels overwhelming and kind of heavy for you, because it certainly can. We're going to talk about how we can help children overcome these things. And I always like to start trainings when we're talking about childhood adversity with this lovely picture right here, because I think this serves as a great analogy for us when we think about childhood adversity, even though it looks completely random, I'm sure. So this is actually an X-ray of my neck, but whether it was my neck or somebody else's, you can see that there are some plates and screws there kind of holding it together. And this is speaks to the fact that there has been some damage to my neck or my cervical spine. I've had degenerative disc disease and have suffered with that for a long time and have chronic neck pain. And if any of you have had chronic pain at any point, you know how much that can affect your mood, your attitude, your ability to focus and concentrate. All of that can affect your relationships with other people and how you operate at work and in life in general. And this is something we can compare to childhood adversity, because it's not something that we see, but it's something that an individual might be living with. And you may be interacting every day with children or with adults who have experienced really hard things in their childhood that they are carrying with them every day, and that may be affecting how they interact with the world around them, but you don't see it. So it's important for us, as we're learning this information and understanding more about childhood adversity, for us to really be connecting with the fact that we don't always know what's going on, but we have to be sensitive to the fact that there may be something there that we don't see. Now, we're going to take that information and dive into some neuroscience, looking at understanding the impact of toxic stress on the developing brain. Now, I always think of this is our little science class for the morning. And I was an English major, not a science major, so I love the fact that I get to teach the science information here. But we want to take a look here at the human nervous system, which is made up of our brain, our spinal cord, and our peripheral nerves. And in our peripheral nerves, we have all of these single nerve cells that send messages up to our brain. And this human nervous system is really designed to help keep us alive. It's all about our survival. That's why it's so important for these single nerve cells to be sending these messages up to our brain, because that's what causes us to act or react in an emergency situation so that we can survive. And one example of this is if you touch a hot stove. We've all heard this before, right? You touch a hot stove and what happens? you immediately jerk your hand away, right? Because those single nerve cells felt the heat and sent these messages to your peripheral, through your peripheral nerves up your spinal cord to your brain, and your brain said, move your hand. You didn't have to stop and think about that. Your body is designed to do that automatically so that you don't have to stop and think about it. So that's our human nervous system, designed to help keep us alive. Now, if we break down a little bit more what happens in the brain, you see here 3 images over 3 different time periods of childhood. So at first, we have what's going on at birth. And you see these little branches. The little branches are neural connections that are forming in our brain. And these connections are experience dependent. So when we come into the world, we've had very few experiences. There's not a lot we need to know how to do in order to survive. So you see very few neural connections here early on. Not a whole lot happening when we first come into the world. But as we get into elementary age, and for those of you who work with Head Start or First Steps or Little Steps, any of those programs, you know how important it is for children to have exposure to all these new experiences in early childhood. We want for kids to be learning language, and that means that we want adults talking to them, singing to them, reading to them, exposing them time and time again to these experiences that are strengthening these neural connections in their brain. So that's what's going on from birth to elementary age, is we are growing new connections based on experiences that we're having. And what can happen is if we have bad experiences, if our brain at some point has to go into that survival mode where it's sending messages to help keep us alive, like what we just looked at, when that happens, our brain says, this is really important information because we had to do something here to survive and take care of ourselves. So those neural connections get really strong too. So we've got strong neural connections forming when there are negative experiences, and then the more positive experiences we're having, the stronger those neural connections get. That's important because when we get into puberty, our brain actually starts to prune away the things that didn't seem to be very important. So if we only were exposed to language a little bit, if maybe mom didn't talk to us very much because mom thought you can't talk back to me, so I'm not going to talk to you. The child didn't get read to very often. The child wasn't exposed to music and language that way. Then they're not going to have strong connections related to language, and the experiences that they did have will get pruned away. So this is one of the areas where kids are not set up well for school if they're not having those experiences during those early years of life. Again, why that's so critical for kids to have those experiences. And if the negative experiences happened at a young age, then in puberty, our brain has said, again, this was really important information and we needed to do something to survive this. So we are keeping this connection. And what can happen is if children experience toxic stress, which is repeated activation of their stress response system, and we're going to break that down here in a minute, then their brain strengthens in those areas and doesn't really make a whole lot of room to keep those other experiences around because it's pruning away what wasn't as important and hanging on to what was more important. Now, children who don't experience toxic stress or don't experience abuse or neglect in childhood are gaining all of these positive connections, and that's sticking around with them. So they're better able to explore the world and learn and grow and develop. And they are more set up for success than children who experience abuse or neglect. Now, I'm going to show you a little video of this that gets into this a little bit more and also presents the information in a slightly different way for you. So I want to make sure that all of this makes sense. And then after we watch this video, I'm going to show you a little bit about how the stress response system actually works in the brain. So let's check this video out.
In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So that gave you just a little glimpse into what's going on in the brain. And I'm going to break this down for you a little bit more. And I should say, because I didn't say this in the beginning, if you guys have questions at any point, I have a tendency to talk really fast and go through information maybe faster than you need me to. So if you have questions at any point or you need me to slow down or revisit something, please put that in the chat box. I love to pay attention to the chat and respond to any questions that you might have, or maybe even when we get into some of the other information, you might think of some examples of where you've seen this at play in the lives of children that you work with. So what we see here, you saw this in the video, these are different regions of the brain that are developing in early childhood. Our brain is 90% developed by age 6. So all of these areas of the brain are building a foundation on which everything else that we are learning and doing as we have new experiences is growing. So when children have, I've used language as an example here, when children have all of that exposure to language when they're young, then they're better equipped with that foundation to be able to do more with language as they get older. Once they know words and they know how to put words into sentences, they're able to write papers and to write letters or send text messages. All those sorts of things can happen because that foundation of language has been built. But what we know is that when the stress response system is activated and it sends blood and hormones and diverts what I think of as energy away from these regions of the brain in order to operate in a way that helps us survive, then these areas of the brain are not fully developing the way that we want them to. That's key for us to understand. So we're going to look at the 3 main regions of the stress response system. When we experience stress, it activates our brain stem. That handles all of our automatic body functions, and this part of our brain is fully developed when we come into the world. It handles our blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, all of those things that have to be fully functional to keep us alive. It's fully developed when we come into the world because it's critical for us to just be breathing. And then another part of our stress response is our limbic system. That's the alarm system of our brain. So it alerts us to an emergency or a crisis or some sort of danger. And then our prefrontal cortex, which is the last part to fully develop, it's not fully developed until our mid-20s. It handles our rational and logical thinking. So it helps us be able to break down and process information. These are 3 areas that are affected by stress. So I want you to imagine, if you will, that you're exposed to something that causes you stress. An example that I love to use is snakes. When I see a snake, I am terrified, all right? I hate snakes. So that snake activates my stress response system and sets off the alarm. When the alarm goes off, the alarm sends messages down my spinal cord to my peripheral nerves for me to act. This is where fight, flight, or freeze happens. I don't stop and think about what's happening. I respond automatically. So when I see that snake, before I even look to check and see if maybe it's just a tree branch that looks like a snake, I'm not stopping to process that. I am running or jumping up on something or trying to get away as quickly as I can, which is good because my prefrontal cortex actually isn't working anyway. It doesn't allow me the time to stop and process before I respond. So this is great because it helps keep me alive, right? This is what we want to have happen. But imagine, if you will, if a child is terrified of snakes, and every day when that child goes home from school, there's a snake in their house. All right. So every day, this stress response system gets activated. And the more that happens, the more the stress response system dysregulates and becomes sensitized. And what that means is that they always feel like there's a threat. I'll give you another example related to abuse or neglect. So if a child is physically abused by his mother, and he knows that when mom starts walking towards him with an angry face, she's going to hurt him, okay? So anytime mom is walking in his direction, he knows that he's about to be hit. So he runs and hides under his bed. That's his automatic instinctual response. He doesn't have to stop and think about what to do in that situation. He responds immediately because he senses that there's a threat, okay? When that child is in school and a teacher starts to walk in his direction, and maybe she's upset with him about something and maybe she's not, she's just walking in his direction, and that, even though it's a safe situation, that sets off his stress response system and he runs and hides. Now, that's a behavior that doesn't make any sense when he's in the classroom, but his prefrontal cortex is sensitized. It's not working in this situation. So he's not able to stop and process that this is a different environment. This isn't mom. I'm actually safe here. He doesn't stop to process that. He responds automatically and runs and hides. So we can see here, this is two different worlds that kids may grow up in. So kids who grow up in dangerous environments where there is abuse or neglect, they are constantly in fight, flight, or freeze mode. So what we just saw from the stress response system, they are consistently exposed to danger. Their brains and their bodies are always in fight, flight, or freeze. And imagine for just a second how tense you get, how much your heart rate and your blood pressure goes up. You may start sweating or get cold and clammy when you experience something that causes you stress, like the snake. Or if it's in the middle of the night and you're home alone and you start hear creaking and you think somebody's outside your door. You know how you start to feel in your body because you're terrified that there's something there, that there's somebody there to hurt you. So imagine that feeling all the time. That's where children are when they grow up in dangerous environments. And this fight, flight, or freeze mode keeps them constantly focused on the here and now, because they're constantly in survival mode. They're not able to process information the way that we would want them to. They're not able to think a whole lot about the future. It's hard for them to focus, to sit still, all of those sorts of things that we want kids to do to be successful in school. And so they're able to survive the worst conditions. And that's the good news. Because our human nervous systems are designed to keep us alive, these kids can survive really hard conditions. You've heard stories about kids who have overcome incredible odds. Part of that is because the human nervous system did what it needed to do to help kids stay alive. Compare this to a child who grows up in a safe, loving environment. That child, because they don't have these neural connections forming in their brain for emergencies, they're able to form neural connections that are helping them learn and grow and develop. They can form relationships with people. They can process information. They can see possibilities for their future. And you can see how all of those things would help them to be more successful. Now, they might struggle in bad conditions. When something hard or challenging comes their way, it may be more difficult for them to deal with that and overcome this, but they can survive in the best conditions. And it's interesting because even kids who grow up in dangerous environments don't always do well in the best conditions. It takes some adjustment for them to accept the fact that I'm no longer in danger and I no longer have to be in fight, flight, or freeze. We'll talk a little bit about how kids can overcome that, but it does take some work. So we see this idea of adaptations versus expectations. And here's where I'd love if you have some examples of this to put in the chat. I always love to hear where people see this, but I'll give you another example. So we talked about the child who, when an adult starts walking towards him, that causes his alarm system to go off. So he goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode. Another example of this may be a child who experiences food insecurity. And so they go to school and have a tendency to binge whatever they get their hands on to eat. They may steal food from other people. They may hoard food. So when they get their hands on food, they're taking it home and hiding it. Or maybe they're stealing food and taking it home and sharing it with their siblings because they don't know when they're going to eat again. So they made adaptations. When we know that there's food insecurity at home, it makes perfect sense that they would binge or steal food or hoard food. That makes sense, right? You wouldn't question the reality of that situation and the response to it. But when we're in school, that's inappropriate behavior. We don't want kids stealing other people's food. We don't want to think that kids are hoarding food throughout the day as they get their hands on it, or that they're binging on food. So what we need to do is create new expectations for them, but that takes understanding where they're coming from. So this is really the message for us to take away from the brain development piece, is that kids aren't bad kids. They're not trying to be difficult. They're not breaking rules or acting weird just to be challenging a teacher or challenging an adult they're reacting or interacting with, or even being difficult with their peers. They may have an adaptation to something that they're experiencing at home that just doesn't make sense in a different environment. Their prefrontal cortex isn't allowing them to recognize that they're in a different environment and they don't have to act that way. Now, for any of my teachers out there, that doesn't mean that we excuse kids' behavior. But what it means is that we look at them, and instead of saying, "What is wrong with you?" we ask ourselves, "What has happened to you that running and hiding under a desk makes sense? Because that doesn't feel like normal behavior to me. So let me think about maybe why you act like that. And if I recognize that this child doesn't feel safe in my classroom, then my response to that is not to punish the child for the behavior necessarily, but to make sure that child feels safe so that he doesn't engage in that behavior anymore." So we create those expectations and help kids learn how to meet those expectations. So that's our some of the neuroscience. What we want to do now is look very briefly at epigenetics. This is understanding how experiences get under our skin. And this is really new science in terms of the world of science. There's a lot of information that's still being gathered about this. But to give you a crash course in epigenetics, so we are born with all of the DNA that we are going to have, with all of the genes that we're going to have. We're not forming new DNA or new genes over the course of our lives. What happens is that genes may get flipped on during the course of our lives. And once those genes are flipped on, they may be passed down to future generations already flipped on. If you want to get really technical about this, the genes don't flip on. What happens is this process of myelination where histones attach to those genes to help read those genes or not, depending on what happens there. But let's go with the idea that they are either flipped on or flipped off. So if we think about someone who grows up in that dangerous environment and they are learning how to survive that dangerous environment by running from loud noises, then what can happen is, believe it or not, they can have children who are more sensitive to loud noises. Sounds kind of strange, but that's what we are learning from the biology. And I'm going to show you another video that gives you a little bit of background on how this science was originally gathered related to some experiments on rats, of course, because they can't really test this out on people in quite the same way. But I want you to watch this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it after you've seen this.
The sweet smell of fruit doesn't normally send rats running, but when researchers paired the orange, cherry, almondy scent of the chemical acetophenone with a painful electric shock, lab rats quickly learned to fear it. Along the way, extra neurons sprouted in their noses and in the smell processing center of their brains, making them super sensitive to the scent. This result isn't shocking. What is surprising is that the rats' pups and their pups' pups were also startled by the smell of acetophenone and had the same extra neurons as their fathers, despite never having been introduced to either their dads or the fruity scent before. But how could the pups have inherited something that their fathers learned? Basic genetics tells us that only DNA gets passed along to offspring. Characteristics like memories, scars, or giant muscles can't get passed on since acquiring them doesn't alter the genetic code. But it turns out that instilling fear in the rats did trigger genetic changes, not in the DNA sequence itself, but instead in how that code was read and used in the rats' bodies. In every cell, biological machinery constantly translates DNA into the proteins needed to carry out vital processes. Chemical switches attached to the DNA turn genes on or off or up and down, telling the machinery which proteins to produce and in what quantities. These switches, called epigenetic tags, are why a kidney cell looks and acts differently than a skin or nerve cell, even though all three cells have identical DNA. But the switches in any one cell aren't set in stone. Teaching those rats to fear the fruity smell switched one of their smell-sensing genes into overdrive. Researchers don't know all the places in the rats' bodies where this switch got flipped, but they know it happened in one key set of cells, the rats' sperm cells, which would one day pass along the tweaked genetic material, making the next generation of rats super sensitive to acetophenone. Rodents aren't the only creatures demonstrating this weird type of inheritance. In Ivakalik, Sweden, boys who suffered through tough winter famines went on to have super healthy sons, with extremely low rates of heart disease and diabetes. And their sons had the same excellent health, living an unbelievable 32 years longer on average than the grandsons of boys who hadn't gone hungry. To be clear, this does not mean that we should start starving our kids for the benefit of future generations. Scientists don't even know yet exactly which switches the Swedish famines flipped. While we have been able to connect specific epigenetic changes to health effects in mice, we're a long way off from being able to make those connections in humans. That may sound like a bummer, but it's mostly because we humans don't live in the well-controlled environment of a laboratory. And for that, we should be grateful.
All right, This is a little bit complicated. And for me, I feel like it's always a little bit over my head to think about how this works. I've done a lot of reading and studying and watching videos from experts on this. And the big takeaway here is that when one generation has experiences that cause their bodies to make adaptations to survive that experience, they can pass those adaptations down to the next generation. So the example that you heard of Ivekalik, Sweden, that those men, their bodies made adaptations to help them survive that famine, and they passed down those adaptations to future generations. Now, if we think about this related to the Holocaust as an example, the Holocaust was an environment for kids who survived concentration camps. Some of them grew up at some level in concentration camps, and they were more likely to have higher rates of anxiety that formed because of the environment that they were in. That makes sense, right? So their bodies adapted to the environment, and they were more anxious than other people might have been. They are more likely to have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who also have higher rates of anxiety, even though they had no firsthand experience whatsoever of the Holocaust and living in concentration camps. We can think about applying this information to chattel slavery, looking at Native Americans and the Trail of Tears, looking at any generation of people who experienced severe hardship, that there may be things that happened in their bodies that were passed down from generation to generation to generation. So what we may see in people today is not always a response that they have to their environment in the moment, but a response that they have based on experiences that their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents may have had themselves. Really interesting to think about. And it's one of the reasons that when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, which we're going to do now, we think of not just these experiences that children may have right now, but we also know that historical trauma can affect the brain in the same way or in similar ways. Now we want to talk about the ACE study itself so that we understand why this brain science makes such a big difference. There was a study done in the mid-1990s by Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti. Robert Anda at the time was studying smoking cessation, and Dr. Vincent Felitti was working on obesity prevention. And one of the things, just to give you a little bit of background on Dr. Felitti's work, he was working with a program and had a cohort of participants that were losing a lot of weight. They were morbidly obese, 300, 400 pounds, and they would go through this weight loss process and lose hundreds of pounds, drastic weight loss, lots of success there. But what he found was that over time, several of them started gaining that weight back. And he couldn't understand why they were doing that. And really by accident one day, he asked one of the women who was having this issue of gaining the weight back if she had experienced any sexual abuse when she was a child. And she said that she had. And what he started to see by asking other participants is that there were a number of women who had experienced sexual abuse as children who were gaining their weight back. And he had one example in particular of a woman who told him, as she started to gain the weight back, that she had a new coworker at work who, now that she had lost all of this weight and she was feeling more attractive, feeling better about herself and maybe looking more attractive to other people, that she had a new coworker who had been hitting on her, and it was making her feel very uncomfortable. So her response to that, because of the sexual abuse she had experienced as a child, was to start gaining this weight back back so that she no longer seemed attractive to him. That was sort of her defense mechanism for protecting herself. So as they started to see these things in the work that they were doing, they began to make some connections between what happens in childhood and possible health and social outcomes as adults. They did a study of over 17,000 participants in San Diego, California, and they asked them 10 questions. The questions were yes or no questions, broken down into 3 categories. 1, household dysfunction, 1, physical abuse or neglect, and 1, abuse, and then the other of neglect. The questions were yes or no. People answered those 10 questions and at the end had an ACE score of 0 to 10. That was the way that they measured it. And then they also gathered health and social data on these individuals. So they were able to compare where folks were as adults compared with what happened to them when they were children. And here's what they saw. This shows you again the breakdown of those 10 questions. So the category of household dysfunction includes substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, having someone in the home with a mental illness, battered mothers, and that was the way that they specifically asked that question, was domestic violence with the mother being mistreated, or did someone in the household become incarcerated? That was household dysfunction. And then did you experience emotional or physical neglect? And did you experience emotional, physical, or sexual abuse? These were the 10 categories. And you see here the outcomes from that original study that was done in the mid-1990s. 28% of those individuals had experienced physical abuse. 27% were exposed to someone in the house misusing substances. 23% experienced parental separation or divorce, and then the percentages go down from there. One of the things that was surprising about this study in particular is that those 17,000 participants were predominantly white, middle upper class, college educated. So it was a population to completely stereotype that people would have assumed had great childhoods, that they grew up to be successful adults that had good jobs and made good money and were doing well for themselves, in the world's eyes of doing well for yourself. So they wouldn't have thought, you wouldn't have looked at them and thought that they had any of these challenges when they were growing up. But the reality is, what they found is that we never know what happens behind closed doors. And there was also a sense that if the numbers were this high among that population, how much higher might they be in populations where there was exposure to much more just community chaos in general. If we break down the number of ACEs by looking at that ACE score 0 to 10, 33% of those study participants had 0 ACEs, 26% had 1, 16% had 2, 10% had 3, and 16% had 4 or more. So we can kind of see where they were overall in terms of number of ACEs. And this was the connection to the ACE score and health problems as adults. There is a direct dose-response relationship between the number of ACEs that they had and health problems in adulthood. This is why this study was so powerful in the world of public health, because now we knew that it's not enough to say to people, you smoke and we need to get you to stop smoking. It's also important to say you smoke and let's figure out why you started smoking and see if we can address that, because that's ultimately what's going to help you stop. If you look at misusing substances, there is a reason why people misuse substances that goes beyond the chemical addiction that happens there. People are using substances or drinking heavily because that helps them feel better or not feel at all because of things that they may have experienced. So to help them stop those behaviors, what needs to happen is not just withdrawal from those things, but also understanding what sparked using this in the first place. And let's see how we can dive in and address that so that you can really make a difference in overcoming this. We see there's a connection between ACEs and depression. Depression rates are higher in women than they are in men, but you still see this dose-response relationship between the ACE score and the percentage of those who are depressed. And here's what we know, interestingly enough, that people smoke. And we all know at this point that smoking isn't a healthy behavior, that it can cause all sorts of negative health outcomes for us. But the reality is that smoking helps with anxiety, depression, and difficulty concentrating. There's a reason why people smoke. And I always use my husband as an example when I'm talking about ACE data. My husband has an ACE score of 7. And he has given me permission to share everything that I want to share about him. So don't feel like I'm ratting my husband out here. But he has an ACE score of 7, and he started smoking around the age of 13 or 14. And he began to smoke when he was experiencing stress. He suffers with depression, and that's something that he manages well now. But when he was younger, when he started to feel stress, he immediately picked up a cigarette because that helped to calm him. And we see a lot of people that's part of their regular routine, is when they start to feel overwhelmed or stressed out. That's when they are most likely to go pick up a cigarette. Okay. So there is a motivating reason for people smoking and engaging in this high-risk behavior. And what we can see here is that the earlier someone starts to smoke has a connection to their ACE score. Their current smoking, which really speaks to if someone starts smoking at an early age, it is more difficult for them to stop smoking. So they are more likely to currently be smokers, and you see the connection there. And then the longer people smoke, the more likely they are to have negative health outcomes related to that, like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So we see the connection to that too. And again, if we stop and think about what motivated that behavior in the first place, it may have started out as a kid just trying to be cool because somebody else was smoking and he didn't want to be left out, that sort of thing. But once he realized that the smoking helped with certain feelings that he was having, that may have led to becoming a chronic smoker. So for my husband, once he realized that he smoked to manage stress, anxiety, and depression, he began to adopt different behaviors when he started feeling stressed. And that, with the support also of Chantix, it wasn't a magical overcoming smoking. He stopped smoking when he was 37. He is now 42 and hasn't smoked a cigarette in the past 5 years. So we credit a lot of that ability to stop because he looked at what was motivating that behavior in the first place. Here are some connections we see to adverse childhood experiences and health and social problems in adulthood. So we've got alcoholism and our alcohol abuse, or what we would now say is alcohol misuse, chronic obstructive lung disease, coronary heart disease, depression, drug misuse, fetal death, intimate partner violence, liver disease, mental health problems, obesity, sexual behavior problems, smoking, unintended pregnancy, violence, and workplace problems. And this is just a few. The list is much longer than this. And it's interesting, without getting into too heavily into all of the science, the connection between some of these health outcomes is related to that fight, flight, or freeze mode and all of those things that are happening in our brain that affect the different regions related to our mental health, just as an example. And so that can cause some challenges there. Does any of this information surprise you? Now, we've talked about a lot so far, and I haven't stopped and done a check-in with you, but is there anything about this that surprises you, or that you that maybe resonates with you because it's something that you are seeing in folks around you? You can feel free to unmute yourself or put in the chat box if you've got anything to add. Okay, I'm not seeing anything here. I do want to say, okay, I see Kim says yes, especially the stress levels and needing stimulants. Surprised by the number of generations impacted by trauma? Yes. That's something a lot of people are often surprised by. And there's actually some controversy related to the science there, but there is enough data out there to show us that there is a connection, even if we can't concretely say that one results in the other. All right, great. Looks like you're getting some information out of this and seeing some connections, which I always love to see. I will say, as we're talking about this, one of the things that we always want people to understand is that ACEs are not destiny. So if when I showed you those categories of adverse childhood experiences, you saw that you had several of those yourself, just know that a lot of people do. And having an ACE score of 1 or more does not automatically mean that you are going to experience these problems. I always worry that people, as we're going through this, think, oh no, I'm going to end up with liver disease, or I'm going to end up with depression because of these experiences that I had, because that's not true. What we know is that what is predictable is preventable. So if we know that there's a greater likelihood of these things, then we're able to do something about them to prevent those things from happening. So an example, I heard a presenter just last week. Actually, it wasn't a presenter. It was somebody who was attending a training that I was doing with the Department of Corrections. And he talked about the fact that he grew up in a home with an alcoholic parent. And so for him, he knew that that meant he was more likely to have challenges with alcohol himself. And because of that, he chose for himself to not drink at all, because he was aware of the fact that if he started drinking, he was more likely, because of that gene being flipped on and passed down possibly from generation to generation, that he was more likely to struggle with alcohol. So he made choices to avoid that. The same thing is true with a lot of these, that if we recognize that this could be a problem, then we can do something about it. And as we get into talking about resilience, we're also going to look at the fact that my husband had 7 ACEs, but he also had a high resilience score. So he had a lot of people in his life who were helping him overcome the hard things that he was experiencing at the same time. So let's look at some South Carolina data. This is state-specific data, but I mentioned at scchildren.org, you can also find county-specific data. Though there's not huge difference between county and state data, you will see some areas that for some reason are a little bit higher in one county than they are in another. But we know that 3 in 5 South Carolinians report having at least one ACE. That's 60% of the population. So if you have any ACEs, you are in the majority of the population of South Carolina. And this is also in line with national data too. So ACEs are common. It is not unusual to have an ACE score of 1 or more. And if we break this down a little bit further, 25% of South Carolinians who report having an ACE report having just 1. 14% report having 2, 9% report having 3, and then 12% report 4 or more ACEs. Now, if you can remember those categories, I'm going to give you the categories again, and I want you to guess which category is the highest among South Carolinians who report having any ACEs. So we have sexual abuse and physical neglect and emotional neglect. Then we have emotional abuse, and in the areas of household dysfunction, we have exposure to someone with a mental illness, exposure to someone who has been incarcerated, exposure to someone who struggles with substance misuse, divorce or separation of a parent, and mother being treated violently or intimate partner violence in the home. Any guesses on which of those might be most common? I know that was a lot of information for you to try to remember. But which do you think might be most common in South Carolina? So we've got divorce and substance misuse, divorce, physical abuse, witnessing violence, mental health. So that would get to emotional abuse, or someone in the household, someone in the household having a mental illness. Okay, so there's lots of great examples, and we do know that for those of you who weren't aware, when we think about domestic violence, South Carolina currently ranks 9th in the nation for women killed by men. And that number has actually gone down in the past few years, but we have been in the top 10 for at least the past 5 years. So we know that that's an issue in South Carolina. But currently, emotional abuse is the highest ACE. And I'll actually read you, grab my little sheet here, the question that gets to emotional abuse, because sometimes people ask, well, maybe somebody just felt like their parents were mean to them, and that's not really what we would consider to be emotional abuse. The yes or no question in the ACE survey specifically says, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So the question is a little bit more concrete than we might think. So 34% of that 60% said that they had experienced emotional abuse. 32% had experienced parental divorce or separation, and 24% had experienced physical abuse. And the percentages go down from there. So these percentages are a little bit different from the original ACE study. That original study had 21% of that group had experienced sexual abuse. Unfortunately, the percentage is much smaller here. This data is collected from a random digit dial survey, and people have the choice to participate or not. There are enough surveys done that we can consider the information to be statistically significant, and the questions that are asked related to these areas, again, are yes or no questions. And so they don't allow a whole lot of room for reading into the question. For example, parental separation or divorce, there are some people who may very much think that parental separation or divorce was a positive thing for them, that their parents no longer being together made life better for them. That may be true, but the question asked is just, were your parents divorced or separated? So it's just a yes or no here. And another thing just to keep in mind, that this is data that was gathered from 19 to 90-year-olds in South Carolina, based on what happened to them prior to the age of 18. So it will be interesting 10 years from now, when this study is done again, to see if there was a difference in what was highest among the group that are currently children. It will be interesting to see. And we know too, I don't have a slide on this, but one question that we sometimes get asked about adverse childhood experiences is, what about neighborhood violence? What about poverty and other things that might happen that are greater than just what happens within the four walls of someone's home? And certainly anything that causes toxic stress or it activates that stress response system can lead to all of the challenges that we've seen, can lead to the potential for negative health and social outcomes. So there is adversity that children may experience beyond these 10 things. But the data that we have specifically that I have just shared with you is about these 10 categories specifically. So just want to let you know that. Now, let's talk about a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel and the things that you can do, some concrete strategies to help address ACEs and building well-being. Something that I always like for people to think about, because this has been important for me sort of in my ACE journey, learning about ACEs, teaching about ACEs, talking to kind of everyone in my life about ACEs. Is that I have taken away from this, not just some strategies and things that I can do to help build resilience in children, but I can also look at adults that I interact with who may have experienced ACEs themselves and are still operating with those adaptations that they made. I can learn how to interact with them differently. I can maybe help them learn some new behaviors that they want to adopt for themselves. So we can see this from two different lenses. And I think a lot of times with groups that I'm doing this training for, we kind of have the professional lens and the personal lens. So this is another example that I often give with my husband. He and I have been married for a little bit more than 5 years. I was 40 when we got married and he was 37. First time that either one of us were married, because it took us a long time to get our act together, I believe. And when we started dating, one of the things that I was doing a lot of ACE trainings, and so he was interested in this information and asked a lot of questions. So I had him do the ACE survey. That's some really great date material for you if you want to, liven up your love life a little bit, spend some time with the ACE survey. But what we found in him doing that is that even though I have an ACE score of 0, he has an ACE score of 7. And we were able to start recognizing some behaviors that he had that came from adaptations that he made when he was a child. So it's another thing that we have to keep in mind, because adversity in childhood affects the development of the brain. You may be interacting with 37-year-olds who are still engaging in behaviors that came from experiences that they had in childhood. So they may not make a whole lot of sense to you because they're adaptations to a dangerous environment that they adopted, and those have stuck with them because that's how their brain operates. So one of the things that we learned early on when we got married is that he experienced a lot of emotional abuse when he was a child. His father in particular was very verbally abusive to him. And he got the message over and over again that he was worthless, he was lazy, he wasn't going to amount to anything. And over time, from getting those messages as a child, he developed this pretty strong defense mechanism and began to become pretty aggressive. And anytime as he was growing up, he felt like someone was calling him lazy or worthless or no good. If a teacher was calling him out for a behavior that he was engaging in that was inappropriate in the classroom, he got angry. He got really defensive. He got in trouble for getting in fights. All kinds of challenges came from what he experienced at home and those adaptations that he made. So we get married and couples disagree from time to time. I don't know if any of you are married or not, but maybe you've had experiences where you have argued with your spouse or your partner. And I discovered that he was hearing me say things that I never said. And he would get really angry about something that I said, and I would have no earthly idea where that came from. Because I would say, please take out the trash, and he heard, you're lazy and a worthless husband. That wasn't what I said, but because of that consistent activation of his stress response system, and because of that defense mechanism that he had built up over time, what he heard was an entirely different message from me. And so he responded with anger, and he has never been physically abusive or verbally abusive, but he would get loud. And so we had to sit down in calm moments and have some conversation about where that came from, because that wasn't what I said. My intention was certainly not to call you lazy or no good or worthless or any of those things. As we started to talk about that, and he realized that he had gotten these messages so often when he was growing up, that his automatic response to anyone saying that I need you to do something differently, he took as harsh criticism. So he has now learned that when his stress response system gets activated, that sometimes he needs to stop and take some deep breaths so that he can really process what I'm saying to him and kind of take it through this lens of, is she saying that I'm lazy or worthless? Or is she saying, I need you to take out the trash? And I have had to learn how to be very careful in my language choices, so that when I am talking to him, I never say anything that may sound like you are lazy or you are worthless. I don't say, I need you to get up off your lazy rear end and take out the trash. Never is that language that comes out of my mouth, because I know what his response will be to that, given those adaptations that he's made. So he's learned new behaviors. The expectations in our house is that we do not scream at each other. And we have both learned new behaviors to be able to function in a healthy relationship with each other. So there's a lot of personal growth that has come out of learning this information too. And that for me has been part of this resilience piece, but also understanding too that he had experiences when he was growing up, just like I did, that helped us overcome the effects of not just ACEs, but any hard thing that happens in life. This is where I want folks to know that resilience, building resilience in children, is not just important for kids who have experienced adversity or kids who have experienced adverse childhood experiences when we think about that list of 10 things. Building resilience is good for all children, because if you didn't just come through a hard time, you're in the middle of a hard time now, or there's a hard time coming up. Children and adults are going to experience adversity throughout the course of life, because that's just how life works. So building resilience helps kids deal with when they have a fight with their friend, when they didn't make the team that they tried out for, and it helps them deal with if they are being physically abused or neglected at home. So building resilience is important for everyone. We say that a rising tide lifts all boats. We don't just have to target resilience building strategies to kids who have experienced abuse or neglect. We look specifically at, when we think about strategies, we look at 3 core protective systems. And I want to share this quote with you here, that nurturing the healthy development of these protective systems affords the most important preparation or inoculation, so you think about vaccines, for overcoming potential threats and adversities in human development. Similarly, damage or destruction of these systems has dire consequences for the positive adaptive capacity of individuals. Our big takeaway here is, whenever we are helping to support these core protective systems, we are helping prepare children to overcome adversity, and that can actually make up for the negative experiences that they've had. It's the most important preparation or inoculation for overcoming potential threats and adversities. So we really want to be building these things in children. The first is capabilities. The second is attachment and belonging. And then the third is community, culture, and spirituality. And I'll say again that these core protective systems work just as well with adults as they do with children. Obviously, children's trust is about child abuse prevention, so we focus on the child's side, but we also know that if we want to set parents up for success and help equip them to be the best parents they can be, building up these core protective systems in them is helpful as well. So the first is individual capabilities. Children need to know that they are important and valuable. They need to have a positive self-view. And this goes beyond just self-esteem. It's really a sense of self-worth and feeling like I am important and I have something to contribute that is unique to me, and people appreciate that. I have this little soapbox that I won't get into too much related to this, but I used to work in teen pregnancy prevention. And when I was doing that work, there was a study that came out that showed that African-American teens in particular believed that their body was their greatest asset. They were getting messages from the media over and over and over again that their physical appearance was the most important thing they had to offer the world. When kids grow up that way, that can land them in a whole lot of challenging situations. If you feel like this is all I'm about is my appearance, that's not a positive self-view. So what we want to be telling kids is not just you're cute and you're beautiful and you're so pretty, but we also want them to be getting messages, both boys and girls, regardless of race or ethnicity. They need to be hearing you are smart, you are talented, you are strong, you're a great leader, you're so resilient, you did such a great job helping with this. They need those messages because that's what helps them to feel important and valuable. That's huge to them feeling like when they have a challenging experience that they can overcome that because they have that sense of self-worth. Then the second one here, which is my favorite and really kind of it encapsulates everything, all of the things that we're talking about. And if you take nothing away from this training, what I want you to take away is the importance of relationships to children. So those of you who are volunteering with children for United Way of the Midlands, those of you who are working in Head Start, Little Steps, any of those areas where you're working, understanding that you need to be forming relationships with children so that they are forming healthy attachments and that they have a sense of belonging. There's actually a quote from one of the many books that I have read and love about childhood adversity and trauma, that all of us need to feel seen. And that sounds so simple and so basic, but there are children who don't feel seen by anyone in their lives. They don't have parents or loving people at home who are telling them, you're important to me and you're special to me, and encouraging them and supporting them and letting them know you can do great things. When they have other people in their lives who are giving them those messages, that can make up for them not getting those positive messages at home. Now, obviously, we still want them to be getting those positive messages at home, but if they're not, if they're getting them from you and their interactions with you, and the reality is it only takes one person that's consistently delivering those messages to them to help change the trajectory of their lives. It's a powerful, relationships are a powerful piece in building resilience. And it's important that those relationships are with caring, competent people. And that doesn't mean, when we say competent here, that doesn't mean they have to be well educated or well versed in childhood adversity. They don't have to know all of these strategies for helping support children. What they need to do is care about kids and support them. Help kids know, I'm glad you're in my life. How are you doing today? How was school today? Calling kids by name. I love when we provide these trainings for school personnel, helping them think about bus drivers and cafeteria workers having this information. When bus drivers get to say every morning to Jimmy when he gets on the bus, "Good morning, Jimmy. You look especially happy today. Are you having a good morning?" That little bit of interaction makes a difference in Jimmy's day, especially if Jimmy came from a home where nobody wished him good luck on his day. Nobody said, "I'm going to miss you today while you're at school." Nobody said, "I'm looking forward to seeing you when you get home." He's not getting those messages from anywhere else. The bus driver saying, "Good morning, Jimmy," every day when he gets on the bus makes a difference. So wherever you have the opportunity in the life of any young person, to call them by name, to ask them how they're doing, to encourage them, those sorts of things, they're just so important and they're so easy to do. Sometimes we overcomplicate this and we want to think that there are all of these challenging, difficult, you got to have a master's degree to learn how to do all these things for children. It's just not that difficult. Forming relationships with children and letting them know you care about them is really what this all boils down to. So be mindful of that in your interactions. And then we also know that community, faith, and cultural processes is important. And this gets to the relationship piece too, but it kind of takes that to a bigger scale. So looking at how we connect children to community, faith, or cultural processes that help them have this connection to something bigger than themselves. So if they are participating on a sports team and they see themselves as a valuable member of this larger group, that can help develop their resilience too. So that, and this can look a lot of different ways. Faith is a part of this. So for children who are involved in some sort of faith system, going to church or temple or synagogue, whatever that faith process may look like, children having those kinds of connections is powerful. And then connection to, you see here, the Native American drum circle in this image. That's a cultural process that for children who are Native American, being connected with this part of their heritage helps to build their resilience. Now, I said that you can apply all of this information to adults as much as you can to children. That's very true. Adults need to also hear that they have worth and value. Adults also need to have connection to other adults who care about them and support and encourage them. And then adults also need to feel connected to something larger than themselves. So it works both ways. I do want to show you a short video here on the power of positive experiences that I feel like kind of wraps up all of that information.
Childhood is a critical period of life. Those growing brains are working hard to make sense of each new moment and store things away for later. When a child experiences adversity, that critical development can be compromised in the moment and throughout their lives. Fortunately, just as adverse experiences can harm, positive experiences can heal and change the course of a child's life. Even one caring adult can help to create a safe and predictable environment, help a child to build coping skills, and foster resiliency. When adults are present in the moment, when we listen without judgment, and when we encourage natural curiosity, we can strengthen their sense of safety and well-being. Positive childhood experiences extend beyond the home too. Teachers, coaches, and friends who care are powerful protective forces. And don't underestimate the power of community and culture. Traditions, teams, and clubs can help build a healthy sense of self that lasts into a thriving adulthood. It's never too late to care for a child and help put them on the path to a healthy future.
So in our time together today, we have talked about the fact that adverse childhood experiences are common. A lot of people have adverse childhood experiences. We know that they affect the development of the brain and that children form adaptations to survive abuse or neglect or household dysfunction that may cause behaviors that don't make sense. So we need to learn how to look at children and adults and not just say what's wrong with you, but ask ourselves what has happened to you that makes this behavior make sense, and how can I help you engage in a different behavior? It's a message that I give to corrections officers at the Department of Corrections, that how do you look at the people who are around you and say, this behavior doesn't make sense and it doesn't meet our expectations. Why does this behavior make sense to you? Let me think about where that might have come from, and then let's learn something new together. Let's make sure that you're able to meet the expectation by learning new behaviors. So now that you have this information, you know about those core protective systems, what you choose to do with this information is entirely up to you. And we've got just a few minutes left. I'd love for you, because we do have folks who are from many different areas. I'm curious if you are taking one thing away from this, one strategy that you can employ starting today. Something that you can either do differently or do more intentionally to help strengthen the resilience of either children or the adults around you. So would anyone like to share any strategy that they may be taking away from today? I don't know if we have some slow typers or if you guys didn't get anything out of this training. I'm hoping that you took some things out of this. Okay, you're very welcome for the transparency. I always try to share some examples so that this information feels as relevant as possible, because I think that's important in us being able to apply it in the work that we do. And Deidre, thank you. It is a lot of information to process.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Ms. Dana. You did a wonderful job, and I really always enjoy these trainings. And yeah, it's a lot going in my brain right now. But the thing that kind of resonates for me is the addressing kids by name. And that goes a long way. Even I know that I used to deal with volunteers before, and one of the ladies told me that a great way to keep volunteers involved and also to be engaged with children is to do handwritten things, write handwritten notes and things of that nature. So just responding to them with their name, and it shows that you remember who they are, that you actually took note of what their name is and just who they are as a person.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a small thing, right? Doing a handwritten note is amazing if you can do that, but even if you don't have a chance to do that, calling kids by name goes a long way. So as you are processing this information throughout the rest of your day, week, month, whatever, I hope that you will be thinking about strategies that you can employ to help strengthen the resilience of children and families. And I do want to end today by letting you know about our upcoming Learning Thursdays. All of these are free. You register for all of these at scchildren.org/events, which is where you registered for this one. So our next one is on April the 21st, and that's a protective factor training. We're going to be talking about, interestingly enough, building resilience, because that's one of the 5 protective factors. I'm going to be the trainer for that one. And then I promise you, after that one, we've got other folks who will come in and be doing the trainings. And then on May the 19th, we have another adverse childhood experiences training. So if you've got some coworkers or some friends or some other people that you think would really benefit from getting this information, they can come hear a very similar presentation on May the 19th. Mary Birchmore and Ashley Alsep are going to be our trainers for that, and they both work for Nurse Family Partnership. So some of the examples that they use may be related to home visiting and working with young children. So if that's sort of a slant that you would be really interested in, then that's a great one to join in on. Though it's information that will apply to anyone. So we hope to see you again at a future Learning Thursday. If you have any questions or follow-up thoughts you want to share with me, my email address is right here on this slide. And with that, I will send you out to the rest of your Thursday and the rest of your week. I hope it's a great one.
Thank you. We